Well, welcome back to video 20 and our last video
Last one.
in this series of What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer by Skye Jethani. So, let's maybe just jump right in where we take in chapter 52. Then prayer transforms our fear into love. In chapter 53, then we will see God even amid darkness. Well, I think just to sit there and say, for me, fear is a real part of life. And I think it's really important to say our fears matter.
Yeah.
They really they matter, not because we want them. They matter because they definitely affect us, and we need to take that sort of part of prayer, which we've talked about over the last several videos. We brought it up. It is about being real in front of God, and bringing our fears to Him is part of that realness, and modeled by Jesus.
Yep. I think for me, especially over the last couple of years, I've seen myself and others respond to things in fear,
Mm-hmm.
and that has caused lots of problems and also caused lots of isolation too. So there is
Absolutely.
definitely fear has been a I would say even a bigger factor than normal over the last couple of years because of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think instead of being real in our fear, I think we try to mask it as something else other than fear, as opposed
Yeah.
to really addressing, hey, this is actually fear, and I
Yeah.
think we're it's like we don't want to be vulnerable enough to, even with God,
Yeah.
share our fear. And that's why I really think the Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is really an important story, because this is a guy clearly knows what's going to happen, clearly knows what's at stake,
Yeah.
but he talks about, it shows his wrestling and his agonizing and the anxiety that he is feeling in the midst of this, and knowing, this is not when he finds out, that there's going to
What's
be,
going to happen? Yeah.
obviously the what's going to happen. He knows that this, and there's still some sort of anxiety, fear
Yeah.
that seems to be prevalent, as stress, all of those things. And then we see in this story two responses to fear. We see Jesus's and we see Peter's.
hmm
There's,
let me talk about Peter's, like, cause
okay,
I
sure.
really relate to Peter. Peter, it must have been quite scary if you think about it. There's armed guards
Yeah.
and a gang of people coming to arrest Jesus in the garden. And, I imagine he feared for his own life at that point, but he also has concern for Jesus. And this isn't the first time that Jesus has been confronted by sort of angry people. But here it
That's
is
right.
late at night. They come with swords. They're asking to arrest Jesus, and Peter, like you say, he's fearful. He responds in way lots of people do, in anger. He wants something
Yep.
to do. He pulls out a sword. He rushes the guy that's closest to Jesus and cuts off his ear. And then so there's the first response out of fear is, I'm going to fight.
Yeah, and that's absolutely a regular, quite normal response. So yeah, he decides to fight. He cuts off the ear. Jesus, in response, is love, and he reaches down, picks up that ear, and heals, restores the ear to this person who would be considered his enemy.
This just boggles my mind.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being that guy? You're there to arrest Jesus. You're either following orders at the best case, or at the worst case, you're there because you agree with the principle. This guy's a troublemaker. He's got
Mm-hmm.
to be gotten rid of, and so you're there enacting violence on the guy. One of his followers cuts your ear off, and you're like, my ear, kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yep.
And then the guy you're arresting, who you have known to heal people, picks up the ear and fixes you on that spot. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to imagine what's going through that guy's mind.
Yeah. The conflicted feelings, I can't imagine, of all the stuff going on.
Yeah.
And it does have Jesus say, as he rebukes Peter in this moment, for all who
Yeah.
take up the sword will perish by the sword.
And that's probably
You know,
unexpected too, right? Peter probably
Yeah.
thought he was going to get recommended for
Well,
defending
yeah,
Jesus.
that's right. It's just like, why are you correcting me at this point?
Yeah.
And I think the truth is that our response in fear is fight, and quite often. And then there's many who would be flight. There's many who would be freeze,
Yeah.
and these are typically our responses in this. And I don't want to be so bold that this is what Jesus meant to say this, but I know when I read it, this is kind of one of this kind of with all this in mind. It's sort of the idea of, take up the sword, will perish by the sword. Is the thing is, if this is our response to life, it really at best is going to bring diminishing returns.
Yeah. It's only so many times you can kill each other.
Well, that, or it's you're going to be caught up in it. Like it's this
Yeah.
cycle,
Always.
like even if your response is flight or freeze,
Yeah.
like it is quite often in any moment of stress and any moment of fear, flight and freeze are going to be responses. And even though maybe in one or two instances it was helpful,
Yeah.
eventually it is more damaging than helpful, and it's just diminishing
Exactly.
returns.
Yeah.
And it's we see Jesus, really in this idea that he prayed through that fear and walked out, and it became realized in his loving response.
Yeah.
And one of the things I read it was by Dan White Jr., and he talked about God is love, and so we want to be in the presence of that love because he is love. That's his character.
Mm-hmm.
We'd like to say that we as people are always the same way, but sometimes we wake up grumpy.
Yep.
That's probably downplaying it. So sometimes we do not want to respond in love
Yeah. That's true.
because of something, whatever it is, whether it's as simple as a lack of sleep,
Yeah.
or because of something that's happened, or
Yep.
whatever that is, what it might be, and we don't always feel like loving people. And
Or I can't understand your point of view. So it makes me very hard for me to love you.
oh, exactly. And I think that's just the thing, as we are in the presence of one who is love, and we
And I think,
experience that love.
yeah. And I think that is part of the reason Jesus came to earth and became a man is uh, he shows us a picture of what God is truly like.
Yeah. So then as we move on to the chapter 53, and we see that, and then we see God even in amid darkness. I love that this is a really strong encouragement and challenge at the end. And again, we're kind of revisiting the idea of the compartmentalized life,
Yeah.
separate categories for things. And some of the stuff that Skye brings up is, there's the good and evil, the sacred and the secular, the Christian and the non-Christian. And the idea is living a life in communion with God, living a life with God,
Mm-hmm.
eliminates these defined categories, because we do, in that living this way, we are bringing God into the midst of everything.
And that sort of sums up a lot of the things we've explored in the different videos and chapters. Is that the
Absolutely.
very thing we might assume is evil or unrighteous
That's
might
right.
actually be a way that God is using it in some way to help us to grow or to mature, or at least to know that we can endure even parts of the world that we think are insignificant to God or to Jesus are often precisely where he may be found.
Yeah, and again, going back to the Garden of Gethsemane, I mean, like, again, this struggle, this fear, this wrestling, the stress that Jesus is feeling in the moment, as he does that, he also sees God in the midst of it.
Yeah.
And there's, in Matthew 26:53-54, do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should Scripture be fulfilled?
Mm-hmm.
And like that's just a big thing. It's God in the midst of this, and that there's something, even in God in the midst, again, of darkness, of
Yeah, and I think this is a
difficulties.
really important picture here. Jesus has the ability to overcome his enemies in that moment and push them down and not be taken into captivity. So he shows that, or he declares, I guess, that he has the strength to do that. And
Mhm.
and I guess, if I'm one of his disciples, I would believe him. I've seen enough things happen that he's shown that he has power, but Jesus is sticking to the plan.
Yeah.
And even though the plan requires something awful to happen.
Yeah, and and Skye just again very kindly, boldly challenges that the immature will hold on to these categories, these
Yeah.
one-dimensional ways of looking at life and faith, these disintegrated components.
Hmm.
And if we do that, prayer is an isolated or religious behavior as opposed to an integrated life with God that is permeates every moment of it.
Hmm. This
And for
reminds, no, go ahead.
Score, you go ahead.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that uh, I was reading with my wife Mala this morning in one of her blogs she was reading. And it was about a man who was kind of, he came to be a follower of Jesus later in his life. And he was a skeptic for sure, but he still chose to follow Jesus. And one New Year's Eve, he was uh, discussing with his son after a lot of the family had gone to bed. He was discussing with the adult son on the balcony, overlooking festivities that were going on outside. And he says, I just don't understand the Sermon on the Mount. He said, if we take it at face value, it doesn't make sense. Is that really how I'm supposed to act? And the son says something brilliant back to him that kind of reiterates this point, is that maybe you're looking at this as trying to understand the ideology of it instead of relating this to as a man speaking to another man.
Hmm.
And I thought, wow, that speaks to the communion with God, is that in order
Yeah.
to understand, we really have to be able to have that conversation and be listening to what God is saying and involve Him in the everyday parts of our life.
Yeah. Well, and it really makes me think of Psalm 23 and again, us really living a Psalm 23 life, which, I think we like the idea of God is with us and leads us and along the
Yep.
paths and the green pastures.
The cool waters.
But forget that it's about he's leading us in the dark valleys. He's there with us.
Yeah.
He's there with us in the presence of our enemies. He's setting a table in front of it. Like there's this idea of he is present, and a praying life will grow in the idea of being able to see God even in those difficult times. And it reminds me of the song, like it's one of my favorite songs called Wasteland by Need to Breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about, living in the wasteland. In the wasteland where I'm living, there's a crack in the door filled with light.
Yep.
That's all I need to get by. And I remember there are times in my life where I think, like, I really wish the door was wide open. Kids of that, but like the ability to just know God's presence, that in the moment there's going to be that little bit of light, and it might be such a sliver, but just say, okay, God's here.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean we eliminate the fears and all that we're having. Like we're just talking about, those fears matter, and God wants us to share those fears. It doesn't mean we're not going to have those even in the midst of that, but it is about, there's a light, I can see it, I can desire more comfort from it and get comfort from it and all that. And
I think what it really brings us is hope. Hope that, we will get through this because He is with us. And so that kind of brings us to the end of our video series here. And we will be starting up another one shortly. So please check back in with the channel for that. But today, as always, we have some questions in the show notes to help you kind of process what we've been talking about today. Something that's good for you to do as a personal reflection, or to talk with a close friend, or if you're part of our church community and your missional community. And we just encourage you to take the time and to process the information and not just think about it and agree with it necessarily, or even disagree with it, but to think about how you might apply it in your life. And of course, doing a series on prayer doesn't really benefit anybody unless we actually take time to pray. So we would definitely encourage you to do that. And thank you for joining us on this little adventure.